Okay, I'll be talking about Megatrend 2 today, rapid urbanization and food system transformation. And I'd like to first of all just recognize the team members that are working with all of us on this and that would absolutely not be possible to do any of this without them. We've got Tom Reardon, who I think a lot of you know from Ag, Food and Resource Economics on campus. He'll also be speaking to you all tomorrow morning. He'll be giving one of his famous Skype talks in the morning direct from China. So I would encourage you all to be here for that. Domenico Dentoni and Dimitris Mitsopoulos from Wageningen University. Dimitris is a graduate student working with Domenico. We have Theo Moshe, Henry Laswai, and Jeremiah Makindara from Sokoine University of Agriculture in Tanzania, who've spent the last 2 days with us. Suruchi Badwal and Chubamena Jamid, and I think also others from Terry in India who will be contributing actively to this topic. Jason Snyder and Michael Doleslager are graduate students working with me in Ag, Food and Resource Economics, and I think we'll have at least 2 other graduate students involved in this effort as well. And then Chip Steinfeld and Susan Weiss from Communications on campus, and then colleagues from Ag, Food and Resource Economics, Food Science, Packaging, and Cars, okay? So this is truly a multidisciplinary effort, and I think it's one of the reasons that people are so excited about the opportunity to work in this. It's the most multidisciplinary group I've ever been involved with, and it's going to be a lot of fun as well as very interesting. Okay, what am I going to talk about? First of all, I'll talk about, Tom Reardon is going to talk in detail about what he calls the 5 transformations tomorrow. I'm just introducing those ideas first. Then I'll focus in on a subset of those that will at least be the initial focus of Megatrend 2. And a key focus then of Megatrend 2 will be in the transformation in post-farm distribution systems. So I'll talk about some of the commonalities that we see in these transformations going on around the world, but I'm also going to emphasize that these commonalities occur in the midst of great heterogeneity across continents, across countries, and that we absolutely must understand that heterogeneity if we're to come up with proper recommendations for solutions. And then I'll introduce the Megatrend 2 team, which I have already, but I'll say some words about the actual plan of work. So the 5 transformations, again, that Tom is going to talk about in detail tomorrow as relating to Asia are urbanization, diet transformation, which is really a product of urbanization along with income growth, food system change, in other words, kind of transformations after the farm, transformations prior to the farm, and factor markets, things like markets for chemical inputs, markets for labor, markets for tractorization services, these types of things that really transform over time, and then farm technology and scale change. So transformations at the farm level, at the post-farm level, and at the pre-farm level, all of which are occurring at different rates in different parts of the world. So at least initially in Megatrend 2, you know, these are big megatrends, too big to deal with in their entirety, so we've got to draw some boundaries. Those boundaries are going to be soft, but we are drawing some to start off with. So Megatrend 2 is going to focus on urbanization, diet transformation, and then the post-farm food system change, with perhaps some attention also to factor market issues. Okay, so all of these transformations, it's almost definitional that these kinds of transformations occur as we move from traditional systems to modern systems. That's what constitutes the moving from the type of systems that we've seen for the past 10,000 years to the types of systems that have been emerging over the past 100 years in developed and developing countries. So the questions are, at what rate are these transformations occurring, first of all? And what are the drivers? Who wins and who loses, because there are going to be losers from this process, and then what affects the outcomes. So let's look a little bit more at how we're conceiving Megatrend 2. And I developed this figure focused on Sub-Saharan Africa because that is where most of my experience is. So the numbers that you see right up here are for Sub-Saharan Africa. Similar things, although with some difference in Asia. But we have rapid urbanization. Across Africa, we're seeing about 3% urban growth per year and only about 1% on average rural population growth per year. So population growth is very much focused in the urban areas. We also, since about 2000, much unlike the previous 2 or 3 or 4 or more decades, we're seeing a lot of per capita income growth in sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, we all know about the income growth that we're seeing in India and Southeast Asia and East Asia and so forth. So together, these two factors, the urbanization, the per capita income growth, drive two types of transformations in food consumption among consumers. So first of all, transformed patterns of demand. We're going to have much more consumption of perishable foods, so meat, dairy, fresh produce, rapid growth in these. And this has major implications for processing techniques and the investments that are needed, major implications for cold chains and how do we get cold chains into these systems, major implications for food safety, so that involves both private sector practice and public sector regulation of these types of things, and major implications for the human and institutional capacity to deal with these challenges. Also, in the terms of transformed patterns, we're going to have much more demand for processed food with the good and the bad that comes with that. So, for example, you need major private investment to generate and to produce these foods, but there's also the public sector counterpart where you need food safety inspections and other types of things to go with it. You're eventually going to get much greater scale, which will contribute to reduced unit costs, increase purchasing power, and really drive the development process. But there's also a major negative externality which the provost referred to earlier today, and that's that this is a major driver of the nutrition transition. In much of Latin America, we've moved from too few calories to too many calories, too much fat, too much salt, and not enough micronutrients. An anecdote that I have is that I was in Ethiopia. We're doing a study of the impact of World Food Programme's local procurement of food aid in a number of countries. And we interviewed a lot of CSB, corn soybean blend manufacturers, who were then fortifying this corn soy blend for delivery to people that really need good nutrition. And what do they do with their machinery when they're not producing that? They produce corn puffs, which are essentially vehicles to deliver fat and salt into diets. Okay? And this is the type of thing that's also going to be growing as time goes on. Okay. Also, much greater demand for better quality, better and more packaging, better storage, especially cold storage, and food safety. So these types of things are very dependent on strong linkages, strong coordination across public, across private, with civil society in there as well. Much more coordination needs to be happening to deliver quality and packaging and cold storage and food safety than happens right now. So in addition to transformed patterns of demand, there's going to be vast increases in the levels of demand. Okay? You're going to have fewer farm households that must feed growing urban populations. So a little bit of math here. As the urban population share rises from 33% or 1/3 to 50%, okay, the rural-urban population ratio falls from 2.1 to 2 to 1 to 1 to 1. In other words, every rural person is going to have to produce at least twice as much food, okay, to serve these urban populations. Of course, there will be imports and so forth, but in fact, they're going to have to produce more than 2 because of the grain intensity of meat and so on and so forth. And this kind of move from about 1/3 to about 1/2 urban populations is occurring now and projected to occur over a total of 30 and not more than 40 years in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia. So this is pretty rapid types of change. Demand is going to double every 12 to 14 years. And the transport and marketing infrastructure is already dramatically inadequate in many of these places. If you go to Nairobi, Wakulima Market, at least until very recently, was the only purpose-built wholesale market in the city, and it was built in 1967, has not been expanded since that time. So you've had this flourishing of chaotic wholesaling activity going on elsewhere around the city, and that's the norm in many of these places. So these are the dynamics that are going on, and to some extent, they have their own momentum, and they're going to be happening, okay? So what needs to happen in response to these are transformations, these 3 transformations that I talked about at the very beginning: post-farm distribution channels, factory markets for farm production, technology and scale at farm level. We need transformations in these levels to respond to these changes that are going to be happening. And then we're not going to get those types of transformations without transformations in human skills and the institutions that produce those human skills, so thus Megatrend 3 as part of the global center. So it's really in this area where we have the challenges for research and innovation, for public and private investment, and for policy. Okay, so just some of the commonalities that we see in these food system transformations. Overall, there's an increase in scale, very large over time, which contributes to dramatic reductions in costs, which raises per capita purchasing power and real purchasing power of everyone in the society. You're going to have an increased use of formal standards for quality, for safety, for packaging, and all of the human capital institutions that are required to develop these formal standards in ways that are workable and make them work over time. You're going to have a need for much more active vertical coordination of supply in these systems. And some of this will be done by private firms. So we know a lot about supermarkets and their roles in trying to streamline their supply chains and so forth. But in traditional channels, which are still very dominant in most of the developing world, this really will depend a lot on public sector investment. So a key theme we have here is that private sector is key, absolutely crucial. We must partner with them, but the public sector must be in there as well. Public policy, public investment, partnering smartly with private sector and civil society is really key. In general, we have a move from public facilities and public, and public standards to private standards. But again, emphasizing the heterogeneity that I was talking about earlier, this can be a question of many decades. It can happen over many decades, and one of the questions is what do we do about the public facilities in the meantime? Because that meantime can be 30, 40, 50 years, okay? Vastly more processing. So the implications, as I said, major cost benefits for consumers, major challenges for traditional farmers, traders, and processors. A lot of them are going to lose out and are going to have to move into different types of activities, and eventual emergence of serious modern health problems. So we have these commonalities, and we need to keep our eye on those, but we also must acknowledge the vast differences in starting points across continents, in starting points across countries within continents, and the likely rates of change, because these vast differences have major implications for policy, appropriate policy, and appropriate investments. Okay, so what are some of these empirical patterns of urbanization and income growth? I'll just touch briefly. These are urban populations from 1950 to 2010, and then projections up to 2050. You know, we see Central America at the bottom here, very modest growth. We see, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia with absolutely explosive growth, okay? The vertical bar is about where we are right now. Even if we look within Africa, we see great heterogeneity. Look at Southern Africa on the bottom there. It looks like Central America. You know, look at West Africa and East Africa at the top. It looks like South Asia and so forth, exploding populations. These are really big differences that have to be taken into account. If we look at urban population shares on the top there, we see Central America, which has begun to flatten out, right, the population growth. But that didn't start until they reached about a level of 60%, which is about what you've seen historically in other areas of the world. So when you look at Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and so forth, they're not going to get to today's levels of urbanization for another 40 years, or even in 40 years. They're not projected to be at today's levels that we see in Central America. Okay? Urbanization is happening, but big differences with big implications. Let's talk about income. If you take Asia, including China, Sub-Saharan Africa, and developing Latin America from 2001 to 2011, you take the top 20 fastest growing countries, 7 of them are in Sub-Saharan Africa. You wouldn't have seen that before, okay? So this is the turnaround that we see in Africa. And yet at the same time, the 14 poorest countries in the world, the 14 poorest countries in the world are all in Sub-Saharan Africa. And then let's, again, do just a little mathematical calculation here. If you take purchasing power parity income today in developing Africa, okay, and compare it to today's income in developing Latin America, poorest Latin America, incomes in Africa are going to have to grow 6% a year in real terms for 30 years to reach today's levels in Latin America, okay? They will do that eventually, but again, these are the gaps that we see, So these transformations are occurring, but from very different starting points. Okay, so we need a disaggregated understanding of these problems. And that's going to be a major focus of Megatrend 2. Identifying the commonalities, but showing how they're occurring at different rates, in different ways, with different implications in various areas of the country. Okay? So what is our work plan? We're, harking back to the figure that I put up with the per capita, with the urbanization and then the per capita income growth. We're going to be doing some projection exercises, scenario building on, taking projected urbanization, taking projected increases and scenarios on increases in income, including distribution of income. We're going to be combining that with a lot of data on how households respond when they get greater incomes in terms of the types of foods that they're consuming, in terms of the level of processing that they're demanding, and in terms of whether they want to be buying in a modern outlet or if they want to be buying in a traditional outlet. To develop some scenarios, some data-based, empirically based scenarios for kind of where these systems are going to be in 10, 20, and 30 years. Okay? So that's one exercise that we'll be doing to kind of paint the big picture of where things are going. Domenico Dentoni and colleagues at Wageningen will be helping us really taking the lead on stakeholder engagement strategy. We're going to be very conscious about this and very purposive about this. We'll be trying to engage with international partners, so the international firms that are investing in developing country food systems, NGOs that have concerns about the kind of investment that's going on. They have a voice and are making their voice heard. We want to have them involved as well. And then there's a whole new world of multi-stakeholder platforms out there, global action networks that we want to relate to and feed our information into and learn from them as well. We want to do this at the regional level as well, drawing on our global center partners and on MSU's own vast experience. So, your ShopRights that are investing all through South Africa, the other supermarkets that are investing, but then less visible players like East Africa Tiger Brands, which is not at retail, so you don't see their stores everywhere, so you may not think of them, but they're big players, but they're regional players, and they need to be at the table, and we need to learn from them. And then local stakeholders as well. So in year 2, we'll be getting into some case study, ground truthing case study exercises, and we're going to be wanting to identify kind of the local stakeholders in those, and again, presenting to them what we think we're learning, get their reactions, get the ground truthing coming from them. We want to do a scan of innovative, emerging post-harvest technology, okay? Terry, for example, is experimenting with solar-powered cold storage units, okay? They think that it has a lot of potential, but there are questions about cost, there are questions about scalability. There are going to be lots of decentralized kind of experimentation already going on with technologies. We want to do a scan of what's out there, drawing on all of our context for eventual RFA work, looking at in a more disciplined way at the possibilities of those technologies. We want to do I was calling these literature reviews, but I don't think that captures what we want to do. We want to do a set of forward-looking, critical assessments of the evidence base on a series of topics, which I'll list if we have the time. We really want to focus on, how comparable are the studies out there? How consistent are the findings, and how sufficient is the sum of evidence? I think we're going to find that in many places we don't have enough evidence. We need a lot more knowledge about things. That doesn't stop taking action, looking at innovations, generating knowledge about the innovations, but there's a lot more knowledge that needs to be generated. These literature reviews or critical forward-looking assessments will then, along with the stakeholder engagement and what we learn from them, and along with the projection exercise, will feed into what we call a phase 1 white paper still during year 1. Phase 1 simply because it won't have yet, just because of timing, the benefit of the ground truthing in the case studies that we'll conduct in a series of countries in Africa and in Asia. And by the way, we'll be focusing first on sub-Saharan Africa in this, and then kind of phasing Asia into it towards the end of year 1, and then continuing and doing these same types of things on Asia in year 2. And so all the findings from these literature reviews, the synthesis into the white paper, all of what we think we've developed, then together with the case studies will feed into development of FRAs or RFAs I'm thinking of the Food Reserve Agency in Zambia. I think about that one a lot. That's FRA. That will fill knowledge gaps and test concrete innovations as well. It's all about knowledge generation, but some of that knowledge generation can be about very concrete things on the ground. Are they working? How can they work? Okay. These are some of the literature reviews that we want to do. I don't want to walk through every one of them, but we've got teams organized around every one of these. And so I don't know if we're going to get every single one of them done by the end of year 1, but we do have teams organized around all of these topics, teams cutting across a number of departments at MSU and all of our partners. These are some of what we've identified as kind of the key topics that need expert assessment of the evidence base so that we can give AID the absolute best information, identifying, as I said, the common trends, but also highlighting the heterogeneity and its implications for these topics. So our team I've already introduced. Just emphasizing we have at least 4 graduate students, and I think it's going to be more involved in this work, along with a very wide range of faculty from 4 different institutes.
I'm wondering if you and your team have thought a little bit about what was brought to our attention at the World Food Prize with regard to putting contract farms into these regional supermarkets in the growing urban area. Mm-hmm. It seems like if we did that, we could have people advising the small farmers with using some of the things, say, SNAP and others are talking about, and still increase per farm or perhaps farm cooperatives. Be interested in some of your comments.
Okay. Yeah, so contract farming is a way of getting smallholders involved into some of these lucrative markets. So I've actually looked a good bit at contract farming in Africa. It has quite a robust and long and positive history. You know, the largely positive history on crops like cotton. You know, smallholder farmers in Africa, very few of them would be producing cotton. They're certainly not producing at the levels that they're producing without contract farming, where a ginning company that has the interest in feeding its gin so that it can, you know, amortize its costs there, has an interest in providing the inputs to farmers. In a crop like that, it's generally successful. It can oftentimes have serious problems, though, with things like side selling and so forth, even on that type of crop. Contract farming has also worked on some other crops, for example, to some extent in export horticulture, you know, where there's not much of a market locally, and so you can reduce what we call the side selling problem. And there are other crops where it's been somewhat successful. I think that there's a tendency to want to apply that solution to situations where it's not likely to work. I don't think you're going to have contract farming for maize very successful in many places unless you've got really extraordinary managers, for example, that can really handle this. So it can be expanded for certain crops under certain circumstances, I guess, is my not so short answer, but that's a short part of it, yeah. Yes, Alex?
So how do you accelerate, actually, some of the shifts that we want to see? Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like, what would you see that as the donor community, how can we set up the incentives to help make some of those transitions that are necessary to achieve the economic growth that we've seen in other parts of the world?
Right. So I think policy is a big part of this. I mean, I guess there are 2 elements. I think that we can go out and we can, if through this technology scan, for example, we can find a lot of experimentation that's going on but look at ways to do that more rigorously on different stages, and look at the sustainability and scalability of that type of thing, and do that in collaboration with the private sector that might actually then take up these innovations. So I think that's one kind of general area where we can take action, and we should be able to speed things up. I think policy is also an absolutely key area. You know, when you look at the spread of supermarkets in Central America and South America, and I'm less knowledgeable about it in Asia, but it's happening also in Asia, you know, a lot of this was due to broader policy reform in terms of foreign direct investment, you know, lifting trade restrictions and investment restrictions and this type of thing, and it's led then to real transformation of the food systems there. So that's part of it, kind of, you know, freeing up the space for investment. But then at the same time, you know, you've had one of the fundamental realities that I stress in Africa. I talk about the 20-20-20 challenge, and this applies to fresh produce systems. But if you take the vast majority of Africa, fresh produce sales by supermarkets have to grow 20% a year in real terms, 20% a year, for 20 years to reach a 20% market share, the 20-20-20 challenge, okay? So that's 20 years, but it's still only a 20% market share, and it's 20% growth a year. That's quite a challenge, right? So in the meantime, in other words, for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, traditional systems are also going to be really big actors here. And big problem, but there's been very little investment in the traditional marketing systems. They can be dramatically improved through legislation that is more friendly to private sector investment there, towards attitude change within the public sector to see the private sector as partners in making the types of investments that are needed. So I think legislative and regulatory reform for the local type of system is also really key. So at this point, those are kind of the three areas that I would see. Chris.
In this arena of ultimately accelerating the innovation, and you did speak on the first point about the private sector, but it does seem like there is a need to create mechanisms for supporting venture development of all sorts of ventures. And I guess to what extent has your group begun to at least put that issue on your agenda of things to look at and think about?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and you know, we spent a good bit of our time over the last 2 days. We had a person named Steve Waddell who was here with us, who was very active in global action networks and multi-stakeholder platforms for innovation, the Sustainability Lab and other types of things, which explicitly brings government, private sector, civil society together in action type of action on the ground and research paired to that action. So I think that's really, really crucial that we focus on that type of approach. You know, I think there also has to be, you know, over time, attitude change in both the public sector and the private sector in developing countries. Too often, I mean, the norm too often is either antagonism, each seeing the other as the enemy, or far too cozy relationships between government and a few. And so, you know, there needs to be a lot of education, you know, showing what a broader, more, I hate the word holistic, but holistic approach to this type of thing really can do. So yes, we want to pursue that type of approach and, you know, look at ways at how we can contribute to attitude change also in some of these countries.
Any further questions?
No, there's one back there, but she just didn't have.
Okay. My question is for all three Megatrend teams actually. I was wondering, like, you have, you know, very correctly identified some of the drivers that are affecting the different scenarios. But I was also wondering if you're looking at the scenario of conflict and disaster as an implication towards these ideas that you're looking at. Is that a factor in these conversations?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a real tough one, you know. I mean, Sig talked about, you know, the climate disasters that are coming, right? I think there's been a lot more thinking about the implications for that for production systems than there has been for post-production systems. I think there are a lot of implications. We need to think about that. I can't say that in Megatrend 2 right now, for example, we have a heavy focus on climate change. I think it will emerge over time because there are people that are working on the implications for urban food systems or systems for providing cities with food, the implications of climate change for that, and not just at the farm level. You know, for other things, conflict, political conflict and so forth, you know, it's there. I don't think any of us have I don't see it as a major focus of what we're doing. Not to deny its importance. One of the members of the HESN, Texas A&M.
Hi.
Yes, Takora.
Hi, I'm Takora. I'm the program manager for the HESN broadly, and actually, as David was saying, Texas A&M was focused on conflict and development, and actually Ajit will be down at one of their workshops talking about food security, science, technology, and food security, so we are starting to get some of that cross-fertilization between labs because they're focused on precisely what you're talking about, conflict and development. So thank you very much for your question.
Thank you, Takora. Okay.